The moving truck had barely stopped when a sharp knock rattled my front door. I hadn't even unpacked a single box. Standing there was a woman in a spotless white blouse, clipboard in hand, with the kind of smirk you only see when someone thinks they're about to ruin your day. "Welcome to our neighborhood," she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "As president of the HOA, I need to collect your first month's dues immediately. We only accept cash today." I blinked. "I just got here." "Yes," she said, "and the late fees start in 3 hours. You wouldn't want to be in violation your first day, would you?" Behind her, 2 men in matching polo shirts stood with their arms crossed, trying to look intimidating. It was clear they expected me to fold quickly, hand over money, and thank them for the privilege of living here. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just a random new resident. I wasn't even here on my own dime. I was here for work because I'm the property manager for the entire development. And guess who collects the rent for the very HOA she runs? I let her finish her little speech, nodding like I was falling for it. Inside, I was already deciding how I'd flip this entire game in seconds. They were about to find out their scam wouldn't just fail, it would backfire in the most humiliating way possible. She thought I was a clueless newcomer. She was about to find out I was her boss. Asterisk, the summer sun was blazing overhead as my U-Haul rumbled into the quiet cul-de-sac. The neighborhood looked like something out of a real estate magazine. Freshly painted houses, manicured lawns, and that eerie kind of perfect that makes you wonder what's hiding beneath the surface. I had barely put the truck in park when I noticed something: curtains shifting in the windows of 3 different houses, faces peeking, necks craning. My arrival was apparently the afternoon's main entertainment. I hopped out, stretched my back, and took a long look around. I wasn't moving here because I wanted a change of scenery. This wasn't some dream home purchase. No, I was here for business. I'd taken over as the property manager for the entire development 2 weeks ago, and part of my job was making sure rent was collected, repairs were done, and most importantly that the homeowners association played by the rules. This neighborhood had a reputation for being strict, which in my experience usually meant a few people think they run the world. I had just grabbed the first box from the truck when I heard a sharp, rapid knock on my front door. Not the friendly kind, more like the kind a bill collector uses when they want to make sure the whole street knows they're there. When I opened the door, there she was, mid-50s, neat as a pin, short blonde bob, pearls around her neck, and a clipboard clutched in one hand. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and her tone had that brittle sweetness that makes you feel like you're being welcomed and threatened at the same time. "Welcome to our neighborhood," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "I'm Cheryl, president of the HOA." She said it like she was introducing royalty herself. "Now, before you get too settled in, there's a little matter we need to handle. Your first month's HOA dues are $300 payable today, in cash." I raised an eyebrow. "I just got here." "Yes, I know," she replied smoothly. "And late fees start in 3 hours. We run a very tight ship here, and we expect all residents to respect our rules." Behind her, 2 men stood in matching polo shirts with the HOA logo stitched over the heart. One was short and stocky with a thick neck, the other tall and wiry with sunglasses that hid most of his face. Both crossed their arms in unison, like they'd practiced it in the mirror. It was almost funny. They were trying to intimidate me, and I had to bite back a smile. They didn't know who I was yet. To them, I was just some newbie homeowner who didn't know the ropes. But I wasn't a homeowner at all. I was the guy who processed every single rent payment for the HOA's own properties. Every check, every bank deposited, all went through me. But I wasn't ready to tip my hand just yet. "Cash only, huh?" I said slowly, as if I were thinking it over. "That's right," Cheryl said, her smile tightening. "We've had problems with new people trying to avoid paying. We like to make sure everyone understands the expectations from day one." Translation: they like to pressure new arrivals before they figure out the rules. I had seen this kind of thing before: HOA boards that treated residents like subjects, inventing fines, overcharging fees, and losing payments until people caved just to make the trouble stop. "Well," I said, leaning casually against the doorframe, "I don't have cash on me, so I guess I'll have to mail it in." "That won't work," Cheryl said, her voice dropping just a notch, losing its sugary coating. "If you don't have it now, you'll be in violation, and violations lead to liens, and liens lead to foreclosure. It's best not to start off on the wrong foot." The short, stocky man shifted his weight, stepping a little closer. The tall one adjusted his sunglasses and smirked. I decided to play along a little longer. "Wow, sounds serious." "It is," Cheryl replied clearly, enjoying herself. "We've built a wonderful community here, and we simply can't allow rule break. I'm sure you understand." I nodded slowly. "Sure, rules are important, but I'm curious, how much do you actually collect from the HOA's own rental properties each month?" Her expression froze. "Excuse me, I said casually, "the units the HOA rents out, how much do those bring in monthly?" Her eyes narrowed. "That's not public information." I said with a faint smile. "That's interesting, because I'm pretty sure I have those numbers right here." I tapped the leather folder tucked under my arm. The tall man shifted uncomfortably. Cheryl blinked. And why would you have those numbers? Because, I said, letting the smile spread just enough to make my point, I'm the one who collects them. For the first time since she showed up, Cheryl's confident posture faltered. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The stocky guy's arms dropped to his sides, and the tall one tilted his head like he was trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I'm the property manager for this development, I continued. I process every rent payment for the HOAs. Units, I manage the maintenance schedules, and I know exactly what the rules say about collecting dues. I let the pause hang in the air just long enough. And nowhere do the rules say you can demand cash on the spot from a new resident. Cheryl opened her mouth, but I cut her off. In fact, I'm pretty sure this little stunt you just pulled could get you removed from the board for harassment. Her face went red. This is a misunderstanding, she stammered. We just like to welcome people personally. With two men standing behind you like debt collectors, I asked, my voice sharp now. That's not a welcome, that's intimidation, and it's not going to fly. The tall guy muttered something about having other things to do and took a step back. The short one avoided my eyes completely. I straightened up. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk away. You're going to stop harassing residents for cash. And you're going to start following the HOA bylaws to the letter. Because if I hear about one more late fee scam, I'll make sure the board knows exactly what's going on, and I'll have the paperwork to back it up. Cheryl swallowed hard. Fine, she said tightly. We'll handle things differently from now on. She turned on her heel, motioning for her two goons to follow. As they walked back toward her shiny black SUV, I watched her shoulders stiffen. She wasn't used to people standing up to her. That much was obvious, but I also knew this wasn't over. People like Cheryl didn't just stop because they were told to. They found other angles, quieter ways to keep their control. And if the rumors I'd heard about this HOA were true, she'd be back, maybe not at my door, but somewhere else in the neighborhood, testing boundaries, pushing buttons. I closed the door, feeling the cool air from inside wash over me. The box I'd been carrying was still sitting in the entryway unopened. My whole plan for the day had been to unload, unpack, and settle in. But now, it looked like my first order of business would be watching my back and maybe doing a little digging of my own. Because if Cheryl thought she could run this place unchecked, she was in for a rude awakening. She might have been the president of the HOA on paper, but in practice she just met her landlord. The next morning, the neighborhood looked the same: perfect lawns, quiet streets, and sunshine spilling over the rooftops, but something in the air felt different. I'd been in enough confrontations to recognize when I'd made an enemy, and Cheryl was definitely the kind of person who didn't let go of grudges. I made myself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch. Across the street, a man in gym clothes was walking his dog. He slowed down when he spotted me, gave a polite nod, then leaned closer and whispered, "You had a run-in with Cheryl yesterday, didn't you?" I raised an eyebrow. "That obvious." It chuckled. "Let's just say word travels fast around here. She doesn't like being challenged. You might want to keep your doors locked." "Thanks for the tip," I said, offering him a half smile. "I'll be fine." He gave me a look that suggested he wasn't so sure, then continued his walk. After breakfast, I decided to get some work done. Since I managed several properties for the HOA, I had an office set up in the spare bedroom. My laptop held all the records, lease agreements, rent rolls, maintenance logs. It didn't take me long to spot something that made me pause. One of the HOA-owned rental properties had been charged a special landscaping fee last month. The problem, that property didn't even have a yard. The tenant had called me about it, confused, and I'd been meaning to follow up. Now I wondered if this was just another version of the cash scam Cheryl had tried to pull on me. Before I could dig deeper, there was another knock at the door. This time it was lighter, more hesitant. I opened it to find a woman in her early 30s holding a small child's hand. Her eyes darted nervously toward the street. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm Claire. I live 2 houses down. Can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course," I said, stepping aside to let her in. She guided her little boy to the couch where he started flipping through a picture book. Claire wasted no time. "I heard what happened yesterday. I'm glad someone finally stood up to her. Cheryl's been running this neighborhood like her own little kingdom for years." I nodded slowly. "I'm starting to get that impression." Claire leaned forward, lowering her voice. "She's been fining people for ridiculous things. My husband and I got a $200 fine for having our trash can out 10 minutes early on collection day. Another neighbor got fined for hanging wind chimes. She said they were too loud." "Do you have records of those fines?" I asked. She hesitated. "I think so. We keep all the letters." "Hold on to them," I said firmly. "They might come in handy." Claire glanced toward the window. "Be careful. She's got a few people on the board who will back her no matter what, and she's vindictive. Last year, someone reported her for using HOA funds to redo her own backyard. 2 weeks later, that person got slapped with 3 different violations in a row." After Claire left, I sat back in my chair and stared at the laptop screen. If Cheryl was abusing her power to line her own pockets, it was only a matter of time before she tried something bigger, and I had a feeling she'd aim it at me. By mid-afternoon, my hunch started to feel like a certainty. I got an email from the HOA's compliance department stating that my front porch railing was not in keeping with the aesthetic standards of the community and needed to be replaced immediately at my own expense. The kicker: the railing was brand new, and it matched half the houses on the block. I decided to take a walk and get a better feel for the neighborhood. As I strolled past neatly trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes, I noticed something interesting. There were cameras mounted on several houses, but they all pointed toward the street, not the front doors, which meant if Cheryl or her cronies were making late-night visits or inspections, there'd be no record of it. Halfway down the street, I spotted Cheryl herself, standing in front of a silver SUV, talking to one of her board members. She caught sight of me and her smile tightened. "Afternoon," I said politely. "Mr. Bennett," she replied, her tone as smooth as glass. "We were just discussing community improvements. You might be interested to know the board is considering new paint regulations. We want all houses in the same palette, keeps things uniform." "That's nice," I said evenly. "But as I recall, the bylaws require a vote from all homeowners before changing aesthetic rules." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes cooled. "Yes, well, the board often makes recommendations and the homeowners usually agree." "Usually," I repeated, letting the word hang. She gave a slight nod, then turned back to her conversation. Message received. She wasn't done with me. That night I reviewed every HOA-owned property record I had. The more I dug, the more irregularities. I found special fees for things that didn't exist, charges that weren't listed in the bylaws, even an unexplained $1,200 maintenance expense for a property that had been vacant for months. The pattern was clear. Cheryl and her inner circle had been bleeding the HOA for years, hiding behind vague paperwork and intimidation. If anyone complained, they were hit with violations until they gave up. I was halfway through compiling a list of suspicious charges when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You don't belong here. Leave before it gets ugly." I stared at it for a long moment, then set the phone down. The smart move would be to ignore it. But I'd never been good at walking away from a fight, especially when I knew I was in the right. The next morning, I started my day with a trip to the county records office. I wanted copies of every public document related to the HOA: meeting minutes, budget reports, anything that might give me leverage. The clerk was more than happy to help once I showed my ID and explained my role as property manager. What I found made my jaw tighten. In the last 3 years, the HOA had increased annual dues twice without proper approval from residents. The extra money had been categorized as beautification projects, but there was no record of where most of it had gone. When I got home, I found a fresh envelope taped to my door. Inside was a violation notice. My lawn was too long. I glanced at the neatly cut grass, barely half an inch higher than the neighbors, and laughed out loud. This wasn't just a warning shot. It was a declaration of war. I walked back inside, sat down at my desk and started drafting an email to Cheryl, but to the entire HOA board. I didn't accuse her directly, not yet. Instead, I requested a full audit of HOA finances, citing several concerns I'd noticed in the records. I CC'd the county's HOA Oversight Committee for good measure. If Cheryl wanted to play games, I was more than willing to play along. But I had one advantage: she didn't. Everything I did would be backed by documentation. And when the dust settled, she wouldn't just lose her little kingdom. She might lose a whole lot more. The audit request hit like a hammer. I sent it late in the evening, expecting the board to at least acknowledge it within a few days. But by sunrise, my inbox had already exploded with replies. Some were short and formal, promising to review the matter, but a couple stood out. One was from a board member named Paul, who thanked me for finally bringing this up. He wrote that he'd been uneasy about certain expenditures for years but had been outvoted whenever he tried to raise questions. His email ended with a warning: "Be careful. Cheryl has ways of making people regret pushing too hard." The other reply was from Cheryl herself. It was short, clipped, and practically pulsing with restrained fury. "Your request is inappropriate, unfounded, and disruptive to the harmony of our community. The board will address your concerns internally. In the meantime, I expect you to focus on your role as property manager and leave board affairs to those elected to handle them." I almost laughed. She clearly thought telling me to stay in my lane would shut me down. If anything, it told me I was getting under her skin. By mid-morning, the retaliation began. I walked out to find a bright orange notice staked into my yard: an emergency compliance order claiming my mailbox didn't meet HOA standards. The funny part, it was the exact same model as Cheryl's. I left the notice where it was and went about my day. If she wanted to play petty games, I wasn't going to waste time reacting to each one. Instead, I focused on gathering more evidence. I started talking to residents quietly, carefully. I didn't want word getting back to Cheryl too soon. The stories I heard were worse than I'd expected. One man had been fined for unsightly lawn furniture because his kids left a plastic toy on the grass overnight. Another woman said she'd been charged $500 for unauthorized landscaping after she planted roses in her backyard. The kicker, Cheryl had then offered to waive the fine if she paid cash. Each account was another piece of the puzzle, and I documented everything: dates, amounts, witnesses. I knew I'd need a mountain of proof before making my next move. The tension in the neighborhood was starting to show. People would lower their voices when Cheryl's SUV drove past. Conversations stopped abruptly if one of her bored allies walked by. The place had the feel of a small town under the thumb of a bad sheriff, everyone just trying not to get noticed. But Cheryl wasn't satisfied with quiet intimidation. That Friday, I got a call from one of the HOA maintenance contractors I regularly worked with. "Hey," he said, "just a heads up, Cheryl told me you're not authorized to approve repairs anymore. She said all requests have to go through her." "That's news to me," I replied. "Our contract says I'm the point of contact." "Yeah, I figured she was pulling something," he said, "but she's the board president." So, I didn't want to get caught in the middle. I hung up, feeling the first real flash of anger since this whole thing started. Cheryl wasn't just coming after me personally, she was trying to cut me out of my job. If she succeeded, she could rewrite the records, bury the audit, and keep bleeding the HOA dry without interference. That evening, I noticed a new SUV parked across the street. It wasn't from the neighborhood. The windows were tinted, and the driver never got out. They just sat there for hours. At first I thought I was being paranoid, but when I stepped outside to check the mail, the SUV started and drove off, to return 20 minutes later. If Cheryl was trying to spook me, she'd have to do better than that. I'd dealt with worse. The next morning I decided it was time to turn up the heat. I drafted a second email to the board, this one much more direct. I listed 10 specific examples of financial irregularities, complete with scanned copies of questionable invoices and notes from residents who'd been fined without cause. I ended the email with a formal request for the county's HOA oversight office to attend the next board meeting as an observer. I knew this would force Cheryl's hand. Either she'd agree and hope to bluff her way through the meeting, or she'd try to block it, which would make her look even guiltier. Her reply came less than an hour later. "The next board meeting will be held in private session. Non-board members are not permitted to attend." I forwarded her response directly to the oversight office. By Sunday afternoon, the neighborhood was buzzing. People I'd never met before were stopping me on my walks to thank me for finally doing something. Others were more cautious, warning me that Cheryl had friends on the board who would vote however she tells them. That night, as I was locking up, I noticed something taped to my front door. It was a handwritten note in block letters: "You're making a mistake." No signature, no explanation. I slid it into a folder with the rest of my documentation. If Cheryl thought fear would work on me, she hadn't been paying attention. The week leading up to the board meeting was pure chaos. Cheryl issued new community reminders almost daily, thinly veiled warnings about compliance and respecting leadership. I got 3 more violation notices, all completely baseless. But while she was busy trying to rattle me, I kept working quietly in the background. Paul, the board member who'd emailed me earlier, turned out to be a valuable ally. He slipped me copies of recent budget reports, and they were even more damning than I'd hoped. Tens of thousands of dollars in miscellaneous expenses with no receipts attached. By the time Thursday rolled around, I had a complete dossier of documents, witness statements, enough to make a solid case to the oversight committee. All I needed was the chance to present it. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the houses, Cheryl showed up at my door again. This time, she was alone. "No clipboard, no goons, Mr. Bennett," she said smoothly. "May I come in?" I didn't move from the doorway. "This isn't a good time." Her smile was faint. "I think it is. We've gotten off on the wrong foot. I'd like to offer you an opportunity to avoid unnecessary conflict." I raised an eyebrow. "Go on. I know you have concerns about how the HOA is run," she said, keeping her voice low, "but dragging the board through an audit will only hurt the community. It'll lower property values, create division. Nobody wants that." "Funny," I said. "I thought transparency was supposed to build trust." Her smile flickered. "You're new here. You don't understand how things work, but I'm willing to make this easy for you. If you withdraw your audit request, I can ensure you won't have to worry about violations or job interference. I might even recommend you for a long-term contract as property manager." It was a bribe, dressed up as a friendly offer. "I'll think about it," I lied. She nodded, but her eyes were sharp. "Do but understand, once this goes public, there's no going back." When she left, I closed the door and locked it. My decision was already made. If Cheryl wanted a war, she was about to get one on my terms. The night before the board meeting, the neighborhood felt tense. It wasn't just me. People were avoiding eye contact, stepping inside quickly when they saw me walking by. I knew Cheryl had been working overtime to spin her own version of the story, and I could only imagine the lies she'd been feeding the board. Inside my house, my dining table looked like an evidence war room. Folders were stacked neatly, each one labeled "unauthorized fees," "fines without cause," "misused funds," and "witness statements." My laptop was open to a spreadsheet that connected all of it: dates, amounts, names, and property addresses. Everything was cross-referenced. I wanted to make sure that when I spoke, I had the kind of proof no one could brush off. Paul stopped by around 8 p.m. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead, as if coming to my place was something he didn't want anyone to notice. She's rattled, he said without even sitting down. Cheryl called an emergency meeting with the other board members this afternoon. She's trying to get a vote to block the oversight committee from attending tomorrow. Can she'll even do that? I asked. She can try, he said grimly. But once the county gets an official request for oversight, they can send someone whether the board likes it or not. And I've heard they're sending a representative. That was the first real good news I'd had all week. Paul left shortly after, but before he went, he said something that stuck with me. Just be careful tomorrow. If you back her into a corner in front of the whole room, she's going to come at you harder than ever. People like Cheryl, they don't just give up the next day. I arrived early. The board meetings were held in the community center, a 2-story brick building near the front entrance of the neighborhood. The parking lot was already half full. Residents milled around outside, speaking in low tones. Some nodded at me in quiet support. Others gave me looks that said they'd bought into Cheryl's narrative. When I stepped inside, Cheryl was already at the front table, flanked by 2 board members I recognized as her loyal allies. Her pearls gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and she had that fixed smile that told me she was in performance mode. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice projecting just enough for the room to hear, "so glad you could join us. Wouldn't miss it," I replied. I took a seat near the front, setting my folders neatly on the table in front of me. A few minutes later, a woman in a navy blazer walked in, flashing a badge. "County HOA oversight," she announced. "I'll be observing today's meeting." If Cheryl was rattled, she didn't show it, but I saw the flicker in her eyes. The meeting began with routine items: approval of minutes, discussion of minor maintenance projects. Then Cheryl cleared her throat and moved to financial updates. She spoke in broad terms about investments in community improvement and unforeseen expenses, carefully avoiding specifics. When she tried to move on to the next topic, I raised my hand. "Point of order," I said. Her jaw tightened. "Mr. Bennett, this portion of the meeting is for board members." I looked at the oversight representative. According to HOA bylaws, any member in good standing may address the board regarding financial matters during a scheduled meeting. I have documentation to present. The woman in the navy blazer nodded. "He's correct. Proceed." I stood, opening the first folder. Over the last 12 months, the HOA has issued fines and special fees totaling over $42,000. Of that amount, nearly half was collected in cash with no receipts provided to residents. Several of these charges violate our own bylaws, including one instance where a property with no yard was charged a $150 landscaping fee. I handed copies of the documents to the oversight representative and slid another set toward the board. Murmurs rippled through the room as residents began recognizing their own violation notices in the stack. Cheryl tried to cut in. "Mr. Bennett is misinterpreting." I didn't let her finish. "I also have invoices for maintenance projects on vacant properties, totaling over $7,000, with no work orders or contractor receipts to support them. And here," I held up another document, "is a record of $3,500 spent on backyard enhancements for the property owned by our HOA president, paid for directly from HOA funds." The room erupted. People were talking over each other, demanding answers. Cheryl banged the gavel, calling for order, but her voice was barely audible over the outrage. The oversight representative raised her hand. "These are serious allegations. We'll be initiating a formal investigation immediately. The board is required to provide complete financial records for the last 3 years within 10 business days. Cheryl's smile was gone now. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "This is a gross misrepresentation of our operations. Mr. Bennett clearly has a personal agenda." "My only agenda," I interrupted, "is to make sure residents aren't being exploited by their own leadership." Someone in the back shouted, "Yeah, we've had enough of this." That was when the real shift happened. People who'd been silent for years started speaking up, one after another. Residents shared stories about unfair fines, unexplained fees, and retaliatory violations. Every voice added weight to the case against her for the first time. Cheryl looked cornered when the oversight representative finally called for a pause. She addressed the room. "Given the number of complaints and the documentation provided, I am recommending the board suspend any further enforcement actions until the investigation is complete. That includes issuing new fines or collecting disputed fees." Cheryl protested, but her words were drowned out by the sound of residents clapping. The meeting adjourned in chaos. Some people stayed behind to speak to the oversight representative directly, while others gathered in small groups outside, buzzing with the possibility of change. As I packed up my folders, Cheryl approached me. Her expression was cold enough to freeze the air between us. "You've made a mistake," she said quietly, so only I could hear. "Maybe," I replied, meeting her gaze. "Or maybe I've just made things right." She didn't answer. She just turned and walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. Paul came over, looking half impressed, half concerned. "You really lit the match tonight," he said. "Matches are only dangerous if there's something to burn," I said. And in this case, the fire was already here. Driving home, I felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The oversight committee would dig into the numbers, and I had no doubt they'd find more than what I'd uncovered. But Cheryl wasn't finished, not by a long shot if I knew her type. She'd spend the next few weeks trying to undermine me, discredit me, maybe even make me look like the villain, and if that failed, well, I had the uneasy feeling she'd try something even dirtier. One thing was certain: the gloves were off. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing non-stop. My inbox was flooded with messages from board members, residents, and even a few curious neighbors who had already heard whispers about last night's meeting. Apparently, the news of what happened, me calling out the HOA president in front of her own members, had traveled faster than the morning sun. I hadn't even made coffee yet, and my phone was a flashing, vibrating reminder that this wasn't over. I took a slow sip from my mug and stared out the kitchen window. The cul-de-sac looked calm, almost too calm. Birds were chirping, sprinklers were running, and the same two retirees were walking their golden retrievers as if nothing had happened. But I knew the calm was deceptive. There was tension under the surface now, especially in the HOA board. By 9 o'clock, my office phone rang. It was Ted, the HOA's treasurer. "We're having an emergency board meeting this afternoon," he said without preamble. "Attendance is mandatory for all board members and management." "I'll be there," I replied, already knowing exactly how this was going to go. When I arrived at the community center, the air inside was thick. Board members sat around the long table, avoiding eye contact with the president, Denise. She was dressed sharply, but there was a stiffness to her posture. Her smile, when it appeared, was tight and forced. I could see the storm brewing in her eyes. "Let's begin," she said in a clipped tone. "Last night's events have caused unnecessary tension in the neighborhood. Our residents deserve peace, and I think the quickest way to restore that is to resign." I cut in before she could finish. Her eyes snapped to mine. "Excuse me." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "Denise, you tried to demand cash from me the second I moved in. You threatened late fees without a single legitimate notice. And from what I've seen in the financials, this isn't your first time playing fast and loose with the HOA's rules. That stops today." A murmur rippled around the table. Ted cleared his throat. "He's not wrong. I've been treasurer for 2 years, and there are discrepancies in our accounts that I can't explain." Denise's smile faltered. "Are you accusing me of theft?" "No," I said, my voice steady. "I'm accusing you of misusing your authority to intimidate residents for your own benefit. And I have every receipt, every deposit slip, and every complaint filed over the last 18 months to prove it." Silence hung heavy over the room. Finally, Marsha, one of the senior board members, spoke up. "I think we should vote. Effective immediately, Denise should be removed as president." The vote wasn't even close. Denise's own allies on the board couldn't look her in the eye as they raised their hands in favor of removal. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing, just gathered her papers and stood. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath as she walked out, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. When the door closed behind her, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The rest of the meeting was surprisingly productive. Without Denise dominating the room, people actually listened to each other. We discussed real issues: repairs, landscaping, community events, and, by the end, the atmosphere was lighter. It felt like a neighborhood again, not a dictatorship. Later that afternoon, I got a call from the property owner I represented. "I heard what happened," he said, his tone amused. "You've made quite the first impression." "Just doing my job," I replied. "Keep it up," he said. "You've got full authority to make whatever changes are necessary to get this place running right." And that was exactly what I did over the next few weeks. We implemented clear, fair rules for all residents. We made the HOA's finances fully transparent. We even set up a monthly town hall-style meeting so residents could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. Of course, there were rumors about Denise. Some said she'd moved to a neighboring development. Others claimed she was trying to start her own HOA consulting business. I didn't much care where she went, as long as she stayed far away from this community. One evening, as I walked my own street, a man I hadn't met before waved from his porch. "Hey, you're the guy who got rid of her, right?" I smiled. "I'm the guy who made sure the HOA works for the residents, not against them." "Well, thanks," he said, raising his glass in a toast. We were starting to think no one that could stand up to her. It struck me then how quickly things had turned around. The neighborhood felt alive again: kids riding bikes, neighbors chatting over fences, people smiling instead of ducking inside when someone from the board walked by. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And me, I had gone from being the new guy to someone people trusted. Not because I was in charge, but because I proved I wouldn't let power be abused. The funny thing was, I hadn't planned to get personally involved. My job was just to manage the property. But when you see someone trying to bully their way into control, sometimes you don't get to choose whether to step in. You just do it. Denise might have thought she was the queen of this neighborhood, but she'd forgotten one crucial thing. Power only lasts as long as people let you keep it. That night, I sat on my porch, the hum of crickets in the air, and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. For the first time since I'd moved in, I felt like I could really call this place home. and I knew that as long as I was here, nobody was going to pull a stunt like hers again. If you enjoyed this story and want more real-life tales of justice, community, and unexpected twists, head over to Bright Reality on YouTube. For more videos, like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel.